The diplomatic hall stretched wide with crystalline walls that caught starlight and scattered it into fragments of color across the polished floor below, where delegates from 17 different species gathered for what everyone hoped would be the final negotiation to end a war that had consumed 3 systems and cost billions of lives. Commander Jake Morris stood near the human delegation, watching the alien representatives file in with careful, measured steps that spoke of centuries of protocol and tradition, but his attention kept drifting to one figure in particular. She moved like water flowing uphill. Her name was Vela, and she represented the Catherine Collective, which had remained neutral throughout the conflict, but held the key to resources both sides desperately needed, and her species was known for 2 things across the galaxy: their unmatched beauty and their deadly secretions. The Catherines looked almost human from a distance, but up close the differences became apparent in ways that made humans uneasy with a mix of attraction and instinctive fear, because their skin held a faint iridescent quality that shifted between blue and violet, depending on their emotional state, and their eyes were larger than human eyes with no visible pupil, just depths of silver that seemed to see through pretense and lies. But it was their biological defense mechanism that made other species cautious, because Catherine's skin produced a toxin when they felt threatened, and a single touch could paralyze a human for hours, or kill them if the Catherine willed it with enough concentration. Vela wore the traditional robes of her people, which left her arms bare in a deliberate display of confidence and trust, or perhaps a warning. And Jake found himself staring at the graceful curve of her shoulders and the way her long dark hair fell in waves that caught the light. She turned and their eyes met across the crowded hall. Her lips curved into a smile that sent a chill down his spine and a warmth through his chest at the same time. The negotiations began with the usual formalities, and Jake took his position behind Ambassador Helen Cross, who led the human delegation with 30 years of experience and a reputation for getting deals done even when they seemed impossible. But today the ambassador seemed tired and her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed her notes, which Jake attributed to the stress of the past 6 months of failed talks. Vela spoke for the Catherines, and her voice carried through the hall without amplification, because her species had evolved to project sound in ways that resonated in the chest and bones of listeners, making every word feel intimate and undeniable. She proposed terms that seemed generous at first glance, with the Catherines offering to share their mining operations in the disputed territories if both sides agreed to a complete ceasefire and allowed neutral observers to monitor all military movements. The Zorlak delegation hissed their disapproval through translator devices, and their reptilian features twisted with what Jake had learned to recognize as contempt, because they had expected the Catherines to favor them, given old trade agreements. Ambassador Cross leaned forward to respond, but suddenly swayed in her seat. Jake moved instantly, catching her before she fell and calling for medical assistance, while the hall erupted into concerned voices. Vela appeared at his side so quickly he hadn't seen her move, and she knelt beside them with those silver eyes studying the ambassador with an intensity that made Jake protective stay back. He said more sharply than he intended. Vela looked up at him, and something flickered across her face that might have been hurt or amusement. "I can help," she said simply. The human medics arrived and began scanning Ambassador Cross while Jake stayed close, ready to intervene if needed, but watching Vela with suspicion mixed with something else he didn't want to name. The diagnosis came quickly, as severe neural fatigue complicated by a rare allergic reaction to something in the station's environmental systems, and the ambassador would need days of treatment before she could resume negotiations, which meant Jake, as second in command, would have to take her place. He met Vela's eyes again and saw knowledge there, like she had expected this, or perhaps caused it, though he had no proof and no reason to think such a thing except instinct. The next session began 4 hours later, after Jake had reviewed every file and briefing the ambassador had prepared, and tried to ignore the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical thing. Vela watched him from across the negotiation table, and when she smiled this time it felt different, somehow more genuine and more dangerous. "You carry tension in your shoulders," she said during a break when the other delegates had moved away to consult with their advisors, and Jake found himself alone with her in a corner of the hall. "It's a big job," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. She tilted her head and her hair shifted to reveal the elegant line of her neck, which drew his attention before he could stop himself. "Your ambassador will recover," she said, and it wasn't quite a question. You sound certain, he said. I am, she replied and stepped closer until he could smell something like jasmine and ozone coming from her skin. Jake knew he should step back, create distance, maintain professional boundaries. But he didn't move. Your people fear mine, she said softly, and it was almost sad. You can kill with a touch, he replied, matching her quiet tone. And that seems like a reasonable thing to be cautious about. She reached out slowly, telegraphing her movement, and Jake could have moved away, but he stayed frozen as her fingertips brushed his wrist just above his uniform. Her skin felt cool and smooth, and everywhere she touched sent signals to his brain that contradicted each other, screaming danger, while simultaneously flooding him with endorphins that made him want to lean closer. See, she said, and pulled her hand back, leaving his wrist tingling but unharmed, and I can also choose not to. The negotiations stretched over the next 3 days, and Jake found himself spending more time with Vela than protocol strictly required, as they worked through complex resource-sharing agreements and military withdrawal timelines. She was brilliant and patient and had a way of cutting through political rhetoric to find practical solutions, and Jake discovered he genuinely liked her, which complicated everything. On the 4th night, he found her alone in one of the observation lounges, staring out at the stars through the massive viewport that dominated. One wall couldn't sleep, he asked, approaching carefully. She turned, and her expression was unguarded in a way he hadn't seen before during official sessions. My people don't sleep the way yours do, she said, and we enter a meditative state for a few hours. But tonight I find myself too restless. He moved to stand beside her, looking out at the endless void punctuated by distant points of light. Why did you really come here? He asked, and I don't mean the official reason, but the real one. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. My people have remained neutral for generations, she finally said, and we watch other species destroy themselves over resources and territory and pride, and we tell ourselves we are wise to stay apart. But he prompted, but neutrality is also a choice, she said, turning to face him, and sometimes the consequences of not acting are worse than the risks of involvement. He met her eyes and saw something there that looked like loneliness. The war needs to end. Agreed. She reached out again, and this time placed her palm flat against his chest over his heart, and he felt that same contradictory rush of warning and welcome. Your species fascinates mine, she said, and you are so fragile, and yet you venture into the void and make homes on hostile worlds and fight wars you cannot win, and still you hope. Are you trying to kill me or cure me? He asked with a half-smile that felt shaky. Both, she replied with that poison-sweet smile, and neither and everything between. Her hand moved higher to rest against his neck where his pulse hammered against her palm. I could stop your heart right now, she whispered, or I could make you feel things that would addict you to my touch in ways your medical science couldn't explain. He should pull away, should call for help, should do literally anything except stand there letting an alien woman who could kill him with a thought keep her hand on his throat. Why don't you? He asked. Because, she said, and her eyes held his with an intensity that made breathing difficult, and you have not run from me. The next day, the Zorlak delegation attempted to sabotage the negotiations by presenting forged documents claiming the Kethrans had been secretly supplying weapons to the human forces. Vela stood before the assembled delegates and removed her robes in a gesture that shocked everyone present, because Kethran nudity was sacred and private, reserved only for family bonds. Her skin blazed with bioluminescent patterns that told a story in her people's ancient language, and Jake watched the Zorlak's translator struggle to interpret the visual data. She was proving something, though he didn't fully understand what. When she finished and redressed, the Zorlak ambassador was forced to admit the forgery and withdrew his delegation in disgrace. Vela swayed slightly as she returned to her seat, and Jake saw the exhaustion in her face. That display had cost her something. He brought her water and food from the human supplies, without asking permission, and she accepted with a nod that felt like acknowledgement of something deeper than gratitude. You didn't have to defend us, he said quietly. Yes, she replied, and I did. The final agreement came together over the next 2 days, with both sides making concessions neither wanted but both could live with, and the Kethrans positioned as guarantors with the authority to enforce violations Ambassador Cross returned to duty on the last day looking.